Okay, so we've done some close reading, we've taken some notes, but what do we do with those notes? How do we turn that into a claim about the text? That's the hardest part, right? And it can be a little intimidating, especially because, you're used to an English teacher standing in front of the classroom and being like, oh, this means this and blah, 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 because we've got it all worked out already, but you don't see the process. So I'm attempting here to make that process a little more visible. I really want you to see that this takes me time and effort, and that's okay. It doesn't mean I'm bad at it, and it doesn't mean you're bad at it either. This is just the way this process works, and even as, you get better at it, it might take less time, but it's never going to just be something that happens without work and effort. So don't expect that, and don't beat yourself up when you can't do it, magically with the snap of a finger. So starting out, I need to have some sort of thesis to give myself direction, to have some idea of what I'm trying to do. But it's not going to be a good thesis right away, and that's okay. Your thesis is only as good as what you're going to say to back it up. And I'll have students come to me with really good, beautiful thesis statements, but they have no idea how to prove it. And that's no good, okay? I'd rather we started out with something that maybe wasn't as good and worked it into something that was. So I'm starting out with just like Mildred is a symbol for what's wrong with society. That's an okay thesis. Like, it's definitely not good, but it's not bad, and it works for this point. And as I mentioned, I pulled all my quotes, and I'm putting them here so that I'm less distracted by all the other stuff going on, and so that I've got more room to write, because I am going to close read these yet again. All right, so what I've got written here already is a lot. It's very similar to what I have, what I wrote in the actual book in the last video, but there's some things that I'm adding, and I'm making connections, and I'm really working on this still, processing. So, for example, one thing I've added is this reference to Diana. I'm not sure if, he doesn't mention Diana, but a moon is usually related to Diana, goddess of the moon, goddess of chastity. And so we get a sense of coldness from moon imagery, a sense of detachedness. Is that a word? So we might consider that. I'm noticing patterns, right? We see lots of water imagery, rain, snow, creek. Those are all water nature images. I see it again here. Rereading is magical because, how many times have I read this book, and yet only during this third, fourth, fifth go over, I noticed that her eyes are open throughout this scene. He's talking about her moonstone eyes that are seeing but not seeing. She's wide-eyed. Her eyes are open, which is really creepy, and I think relevant to what I'm trying to do here. I still have questions about the text. I still don't really know the answer to this. Maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't. We could come back to it. The idea of emptiness repeated. So where do I go from here? Okay, I'm close reading again, I'm close reading again. I want you to recognize how many times I'm going over the same passage. I'm getting closer and closer to the text, spending more and more time with smaller and smaller details. I'm not rereading the whole book 1,000 times, but a single paragraph, a single passage, sometimes a single line. Yeah, I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking, rethinking those sections. So now I'm going to look for patterns. What are the things that I kept coming up with? Death imagery, the idea of isolation, alive but not alive. Maybe those are two separate ideas. Water kept coming up. and the idea of constant buzzy noise. There's a sense, like a lot of sensory imagery there, but yet she doesn't feel anything. So I'm going to try to sort my quotes to match up with this. And here I've broken them up because like a full quote might have several different things going on in it. But if I'm trying to group paragraphs by concept, by my ideas, I don't want to have a whole quote in there sort of muddying up my point. So I'm breaking it up. Cold marbled room of a mausoleum, over which the life of the world ran, not touching them. And maybe there's more. I've got water imagery. I've got my constant noise imagery. And some of these are from the same quote in the book, but I'm breaking it up because I'm trying to sort out this text and take it from being just a story and really unpack how the different types of images are working. So this is a necessary step to think about, like, what patterns I'm seeing, how am I going to work through this in an essay. So again, more close reading. This time I'm looking at these collectively and trying to see what these patterns mean. So here, for example, all this death imagery, I feel like everything else I've been talking about sort of comes back to the idea of death. And so maybe this idea is going to go at the end. The water imagery. My question is why, right? We always ask why water? So water is associated with life, but that's not what's going on here. We normally see water associated with renewal, baptism, change. And that's important, right? We know it means that, but does that make sense for this passage and for this character? It doesn't. So Bradbury's using that symbol, but in an unexpected way, and we have to figure out what that means, or maybe not what that means, because we don't have to guess at what he intended, but what's the effect of that, where the symbol's being used in an unconventional way. Don't try to cram it into what you expect, but try to examine what's actually going on and what effects that's creating. So we've got a sort of twisted, upside down, reversed imagery of life. We've got an ocean, but it's electronic. Mildred isn't, swimming, she's drowning, she's dying. We've got the noises, okay? So it's sensory overload. It's pretty interesting here that there's lots and lots of senses, lots of noise, lots of sound, but she's not experiencing it. So that gives me some idea of what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to try to take this outline and make it a little bit formal. I am going to try to, think about my thesis, think about what order I want to put my paragraphs in. I am going to think about how I want to phrase these ideas, because these are going to have to be topic sentences. They're going to have to be claims. So remember, I wanted to put death at the end. Where do I want to start? I've decided to start with water and to point out that the water image is twisted. I'm going to take that and lead it into the idea of sensory experiences as being meaningless to her. And all of this leads up to the idea that Mildred is so removed from life that she's barely human anymore, and that's all a result of her lifestyle. So which quotes go in each paragraph? Now I start to sort that out, and that's where I'm getting all this detail. I don't need to rewrite every quote, but I need to write enough so that I know what I am including. And I'm going to keep little notes for myself about what I am trying to say with each quote. You don't have to write a ton, but you have to write enough so that you're reminding yourself what you want to write in your paragraphs, and so that you're forcing yourself to actually come up with an idea. If you're not forcing yourself to write down what's the meaning of this, then you're going to not necessarily have an idea. Force yourself to have that idea. If you are turning in an outline to me and want feedback, the more the better, because then I'm going to be able to understand your ideas more clearly and give you better feedback. I always think that putting more detail into an outline is a great idea, because it's a lot easier to sort of move and change these details around than it is to rewrite a whole paragraph, which is a lot more complex, has a lot more going on. This is a framework of your ideas. It's easy to see the logic that you're trying to lay out. It's easier to see where there might be gaps in the logic. You can't hide problems in your argument with pretty writing. So here's my first paragraph, my second, my third. I've chosen which quotes I want to use. I don't need to use them all. If something is interesting, maybe relevant, but isn't really helping me prove my thesis, don't include it. The only exception to that would be if something's really disproving your thesis, it needs dealt with, okay? So don't include distractions, but something that is working against you, you can't just pretend it's not there. Your reader, in this case me, will probably say, hey, but what about this? And you need to have reconciled that problem. It doesn't mean that you're wrong, but there's some nuance to your argument that you need to address. So this is a good time to come back to my thesis. Okay, I've got a better idea of what I'm saying, so I can revise my thesis. The imagery used to represent Mildred depicts her as a perversion of humanity to the point where she's no longer human at all. It's a little more specific. It's a little more, a little closer to what I'm actually talking about. But now I'm going to go back to the text and see if I can find any more evidence. I've got a much clearer idea of what I'm looking for now. So is there more that I can find? So I've pulled these additional quotes, and I'm going to go through the process again to decide if I want to include these, if they add anything, if they would be perhaps better than some of the evidence I've already included, if they would be good additions to my paper, or maybe I don't need to include them at all. But I want to be really thorough. I keep going back to make sure that I'm refining my ideas, getting as much out of them as possible. I've also noticed that my evidence is centered on just a few pages, so it's not the whole of Mildred's characterization, it's really the introduction. So I changed that word to, again, get a little more specific. So I think that's essential because there's more complexity as the book grows. I know, for example, that as the book goes on, it talks about the machines that change out Mildred's blood to help her with that overdose. And those machines are described as more alive than she is. And yes, that does help prove my point. But I'm also writing a 2 to 3 page essay. So I don't want to overwhelm myself by making my idea too broad or trying to tackle too much at once. I need to keep in mind how much I'm trying to write and limit myself in a way that's going to give me enough to talk about, but also allow me to talk about it deeply. So, am I going to use these quotes or not? You can see that I've sort of written out my thoughts about each of these quotes. Do I want to add a paragraph about darkness? That supports my point. But does this make my paper stronger? Does it dilute what I'm trying to do? It doesn't make me go over my page limit. Maybe I don't actually want that in this particular paper. Same thing here. Do I want to add this idea about the room being empty? Is it more about Montag? I don't necessarily want that either. This one, though, I'm keeping in mind, at least because the contrast between living and electronic, that sort of fits. I'm not sure. That's the best so far. But this one, I definitely want to use. The idea that Mildred is a corpse is very to my point, so I'm going to keep this one. So I sort of go on. Do each of these quotes fit what I'm trying to do? Do they fit it really specifically? Am I distracting myself? Am I being concise? What's contributing and what's not? So really, I think I'm really only going to add that one. And I have decided where to put it, so I add that in. And that's where I'm at. And do I end up changing my thesis again? Maybe I do. Maybe this isn't fully what I want to say. Maybe it is what I want to say, but it needs a little more explanation, either in my introduction and conclusion or as I'm writing. Maybe as I start writing these paragraphs, I get an even clearer idea of what I'm trying to say, and the thesis statement gets yet another revision. So I want you to keep in mind that the writing process is very circular. You're never going to, to some degree, you could never be done. And when you turn in a paper, we may say it's a final draft, but it's just the last one you're going to do for now, because there's always room for improvement. And we've got to find that balance between just turning in the first thing that comes out and working it to death to the point where you're making, a lot of extra work and heartache for yourself. So find that sweet spot. But the key here is that we're always going back. We're close reading. We're going back to revise. We're going back to reevaluate our ideas. We're going back to reassess what we know and see if there's any nuance we can add to it, any specificity we can get. Going back is sort of an essential piece of this process. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about any of this, I'm more than happy to talk about it one-on-one or in class. We'll go over some paragraph writing in a future class, in a future video. So it'll tackle the same topic and text so that you've got a really clear example that you can follow as I develop it all the way to the writing stage. Thank you.